I once had a BnB for some time, and after 3 years, it just didn't work out. I closed shop and turned it into a long-term rental. And I still do that till now. It's been about maybe another 3 years since we started that business. And I've had similar stories. However, a few people seem to have had better experiences than I did about 6 years ago when we tried this BnB thing. So the question is, are short-term rentals really worth it in Kenya today? Does the math add up? Now, hang tight for the next 10 minutes for answers to this question. Kenyans in general, whether you're talking about Kenyans in diaspora and Kenyans living in Kenya, feel very strongly about real estate investments. Often that means owning land, building rental units, or private residential homes, and many, many other options. But real estate is a big, big deal in Kenya, just as it is in many other countries. As I said earlier, the big question is, which of these real estate options are worth the headache that comes with them? But before we answer these questions, welcome to Karating, folks. I guess technically we are right at the border of Karating and the next village, which is Kapunja. This incredible place is in Kapunja, right next to Karating. In fact, it's about 7 minutes from where I live in Karating. So this afternoon, we decided to take the kids out for a swim so they can go enjoy the wonderful weather as we watch them and just enjoy the sun. So this is one of the places that I highly recommend if you're in the village, if you're going to be around Kapunja, Karating area. This is a very popular spot with diasporans. I've run into so many of my fans out here. I've run into so many of diasporans in this place. So it's one of those places that I say you have to experience it to really fully understand the beauty of it. So anyway, besides that, as I say in many of my videos, please be sure to reach us on the number that I posted in this video. If you have questions or if you need help with real estate, building, construction, land, and things like that, we've got experts. My job is to evaluate your project, match you with the right experts, and supervise your work. So anyway, the rise of Airbnb and other forms of short-term rentals has significantly altered the global real estate landscape. And Kenya is certainly not an exception. With Nairobi, Mombasa, and several key destinations like Diani, Nanyuki, Naivasha, seeing a surge in demand for short-term accommodations. Now, Airbnb and similar platforms have really created both opportunities and challenges for property owners, developers, and real estate investors. I may not be able to explore all of that in a single video, but I'll simply highlight a few things. So number one, let's start by looking at some of the biggest draws. What takes people into this business of short-term rentals? The most obvious one is that Airbnbs have the potential, and underline the word potential, for a much higher return as compared to long-term rentals. These short-term rentals typically command higher daily rates, and I've seen things like anywhere between 3,000 and up to 20,000 per day, sometimes even higher, depending on location and the amenities provided. So this can often translate into greater monthly income if occupancy rates are high. Again, underline the word if, because here we are simply talking about potential. The second draw that makes folks get into BnB and short-term rentals is the flexibility part. Because there are a lot of diaspora folks who have BnBs at home, and they use this because this property allows the owners to adjust pricing and availability. So they rent out these facilities when they're in diaspora, and when they come back home, they live in these facilities. So that flexibility is wonderful in ways that you may not get if you have long-term renters, because you can't just come back and kick out your tenants when you're back in. So the BnBs that we invest in really help with that. I remember anytime I would visit the city where we have that rental unit, I would actually stay in that BnB that we owned at the time. So they used to be very popular, especially when they started. In part because they were offering a cheap alternative to fancy hotels and far more attractive options for couples and large groups. In fact, even now, I still prefer BnBs only when I'm traveling with a bigger group. But other than that, I'm not a big fan of BnBs as such, for reasons that I explained. So when it works, when these short-term rentals work, they are fantastic. But as you all know, nothing that generates money, nothing good comes without risks. So when things fall apart, things can really go downside real quick. So I'm only going to highlight about 8 or so more commonly cited issues. I've seen more than 20 issues that I would want to talk about, but again, in the interest of time, I'm only going to cover about 8 of these. Now, the first issue that is now, excuse me, very common with Kenyan markets, especially in high-end neighborhoods in Nairobi, is the oversaturation of the market, which obviously comes with low occupancy. So if you have a unit there that is still being paid for and you're not receiving traffic, then you have a problem. Or if it's an investment that you put in there, and sometimes, like one of my friends has gone for nearly 4 or 5 months and no tenants. So that is a possibility, again, depending on where you are. Now, during holiday seasons, then you have a different story where many of them are really full and you're doing well. And then a lot of diasporans tend to buy these fairly not so good structures built by Chinese. I did a video on it, and I'll circle back on it just to tell you what I mean by poorly built Chinese structures. And that often comes with higher maintenance costs long term. And then in Kenya specifically, BnBs or short-term rentals have a very well-known history with out-of-control parties. And in fact, there's a reputation that BnBs is where women actually end up getting killed by their lovers and things like that. So there's all sorts of security issues around BnB, which is a headache both for the owner and for the clients. And then there's also this issue of BnBs typically just being described as glorified brothels. There are things that folks would do in here that they wouldn't do in their private spaces. So this often comes with a lot of foot traffic, to the extent that when you have a BnB inserted in the middle of a residential area where the other folks are just living, you have issues there. Because, like I said, many people come to these places to do things that they would not otherwise do in their houses or in their neighborhoods. So BnB are notorious for all kinds of nefarious activities that people do away from places that they would likely be known. And then, as an owner of a BnB or a short-term rental, you have to contend with missing items, broken furniture. Sometimes it's just somebody comes in and messes up your entire house in terms of cleanliness. And so there are lots of issues around that. And that may also come with the other problem around unauthorized residents. I have a friend of mine who thought his BnB was empty for 2 years, only to realize that actually there was traffic in there, and the person he hired was actually making money and reporting to him or her that that place was not occupied. And of course, that was partly because he had not wired the place with CCTVs. So unauthorized residences can sometimes use a facility if not carefully monitored. And then BnBs in Kenya are also notorious, particularly when you have terrible people running it, notorious for having secret recording of guests, especially in their private spaces. And unfortunately, some of these guys record guests and then they end up selling those content in adult entertainment sites. And this is a major, major problem. So I suspect this is not a problem you should expect in a regular hotel. But BnBs in Kenya are notorious for that kind of an issue. So you can only imagine what this would mean for a client or for business owner if a client runs into their video in an adult site and clearly it shows that they were renting your place. It's really terrible. And then over time, you have the local governments and national government really aggressively trying to tax owners of BnBs because they see billions of untouched money. So taxation is also another potential problem that you have to think about. Now, overall, if you were to ask me, would I do BnB again? Personally, I would say no. I'm sure other folks would have a different opinion. There are other folks who may have had better experiences. But I can tell you for a fact, before I put together this video, I interviewed several people who have done this. And 9 out of 10 of the folks that I talked to had something not so good to say. So personally, I would not do that. But if you choose to do BnB, here's what I would suggest you think about. Number one, I hope that the building you're putting together or the building you're buying is not financed by a loan. Or if it is financed by a loan, please have a plan for, or at least a contingency plan for how you're going to pay that loan. Because sometimes I think people overestimate the potential of a BnB, and then it turns out you're not going to generate as much money as you think, perhaps enough to pay back a loan. So if you can pay it offhand, great. But if you need to borrow, I hope you have a plan for paying for that loan and not necessarily depending on your rental property to do that. And then if you do it, I hope you consider professional management companies, because these companies have ways to optimize listings, manage reviews, because you're going to get reviews. And then they also ensure seamless guest experiences, which can often lead to higher occupancy rate. So instead of using your friend or your cousin or your whoever you are hiring to get cheap labor, you may want to consider professional folks to manage this, because reviews matter. One time I had a person coming from England staying at my BnB. And unfortunately for me, our BnB was right next to a church. In fact, the church was built after we built our property. And they had like a kesha or something, and so they played music all night. And that guest did not sleep. And of course, the next day he gave us a terrible review. And so when you have professionals hired, they can help with things like that. And then to some degree, you could be flexible with pricing. However, you don't want to be too flexible, because if you drop your rates too far, then the sort of clientele you're going to attract are often the more troublesome young folks who are coming in to party and all that. So be sure you know exactly what you're targeting in terms of market. If you're going for high end, make sure you stick within that range, even when you choose to be flexible. Now, small towns tend to attract more of a range between like 1,500 to about 3,000 a night. So if you're building in a small town, don't build something that you expect to charge people 10,000 a night. Nobody's going to show up. And so small and upcoming towns tend to have a lot higher traffic, but for small amounts like 1,500 to 3,000 a night. So be thoughtful about your pricing. And especially if you're doing a high-end BnB, I hope you include more like hotel-like amenities. Because many people say, I don't want to go to vacation and still find myself buying onions and avocados and cooking and all that stuff. No. So if you have a BnB that has the option of somebody who can cook for folks, or if you have the option of adding a rental car, so somebody can rent a space in your building, but also have the option of getting a rental car at a discount, then those additional perks can make your property stand out as opposed to just having your plain open BnB. And again, with your finishes, please don't build a good building and do terrible finishes. I see that all the time. Terrible finishes and terrible furniture. Don't buy this furniture that you buy that a Juakali made. If you choose to do it, do something proper. And then invest in advertisement. Sometimes we think that simply by posting it in the BnB site, then traffic will simply follow you. No. Invest in putting out your property. And oftentimes after that, people will basically be referred for the most part. Don't ever forget a CCTV. Because otherwise, your caretaker is going to be putting in people making money and you'll never know about it. CCTV needs to be there. Be sure to have backup power, because I've seen guests complain about blackouts, particularly in small towns. So be sure to have backup power, especially for lighting. Now, whenever you're designing and building, I encourage you to talk to people who know what they're doing. And what I usually advise clients, if you're thinking you might have a mix of rental, short-term rental and long-term rental, let's talk about a dual-purpose building that can be moved either direction. A lot of folks who are not in construction really don't know that. And so when they're designing, all they care about is the number of rooms and number of living rooms and things like that. So make sure you talk to somebody who knows what they're doing in terms of setting up a dual-purpose building. And then, of course, location is a big deal. In my case, one of the things that really made life difficult is that we were located next to a church. Like I said earlier, the church was built after our structure. So then they came in, they're still building, it's still in an open space. And in Kenya, for those of you who lived in Kenya, churches can be really noisy. And many people find that very normal, but that can be very challenging when you have guests from outside Kenya, especially. So people would come in and there would be so much noise, especially from Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, through the weekend, so much noise that the guests could not sleep. So location matters. Unfortunately, in Kenya, even if you get a good location, it doesn't mean that things are going to change. So this is why I always recommend, if you're thinking short-term rentals, be sure to design a structure that can be used for dual purposes, that you can go either way. If short-term does not work, then it can be repurposed for something else. There are ways to do that at the design stage and not necessarily later on. So all I would say is that based on my limited experience, I highly doubt that if you do short-term rentals, you will break even within 10 years. And that also applies for even long-term rentals. So rental investment, in my view, is really tough in Kenya, but it's not a bad thing. So don't be scared. You can still do it. However, I want you to think of rental apartments more in the line of a long-term investment opportunity. Which is just one amongst the many things you're going to put money in. There are so many other options like government bonds, money markets, agribusiness that have a much better return on investment. So rental property, in my view, should be just one of the many things that you're going to put money in, especially money that is not really pressing in the sense that it has to be recovered sooner. Rental is more like a long-term investment. Well, I hope this was informative, and if I missed something or if I misspoke, please share in the comments, and I will see you in the next. Thank you.